Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know by Nadine Strossen. Narrated by Nadine Strossen. This book is dedicated to Salman Rushdie, whose unparalleled courage and eloquence in defending and exercising freedom of speech continue to inspire. The book's epigram is an unforgettable statement I heard Rushdie make at his first post-fatwa public appearance at a Columbia University celebration of the First Amendment's bicentennial on December 11, 1991. I am recasting these memorable words only slightly to match the What Everyone Needs to Know series question and answer format. Isn't freedom of speech a non-starter? Asks one of my Islamic extremist opponents. No, sir, it is not. Free speech is the whole thing, the whole ball game. Free speech is life itself. Acknowledgements. Deep thanks are due for the following valued contributions. For researching and drafting endnotes and a list of additional recommended readings, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, staff members Margot Graneth and Matt Harwood, and FIRE interns Nia Kane, Justin Crosby, Charlie Hatcher, Dylan Lasky, Emma Maple, Manas Pandit, Daniel Shaw, and Vidalia Weatherly. For comments on the manuscript, Ron Collins, Bob Korn-Revere, Joel Gora, Jakob Michangama, and Brad Smith. For research assistance, Amara Banks, Yasmin Boto, Michael McCarthy, and Sean Stevens. For assistance with the endnotes and other supplementary materials on the NYLS website, Regina Chung. And for patient creative problem solving with computer technology, Jason Buckweitz. For generating the questions and stimulating the answers in this book, I am indebted to the thousands of students and audience members, as well as many academic and activist colleagues with whom I have been discussing these issues throughout my career. For unflagging encouragement and support concerning this book, I especially thank my husband, Ellie M. Noam, and my literary agent, Carol Mann. I am also deeply grateful to Nico Pfund, David McBride, Larry Heathcote, Wendy Walker, and everyone else at Oxford University Press and NewGen who contributed to the editorial and production process. Introduction. Controversies about free speech have long pervaded our political and cultural spheres. Beyond the profound matters of principle that have engaged society's most brilliant philosophers throughout history, freedom of speech also entails innumerable practical public policy matters at all levels of governance worldwide, from local school boards to the United Nations. Seemingly everyone agrees that free speech is good and censorship is bad. In all my countless debates against proponents of just about every speech restriction that has been advocated in the past 50 years, almost all of them have praised free speech and condemned censorship. But while there may be a consensus on those conclusions, there is no consensus on what we mean by either free speech or censorship, let alone on any of the more specific questions at issue. For instance, advocates of hate speech restrictions maintain in good faith that they are promoting free speech on the rationale that those restrictions will amplify the voices of people who otherwise would be subject to hate speech and hence deterred from expressing themselves. But opponents of hate speech restrictions likewise maintain in good faith that they are promoting free speech because such restrictions will mute much important expression, including expression by members of minority groups. For instance, powerful political leaders recently have condemned Black Lives Matter advocacy as hate speech, as well as disinformation and terrorist speech. Indeed, The more one wrestles with these issues, the more one appreciates their complexities, which are not fairly reducible to a speech versus censorship dichotomy. Promoting constructive debates about free speech. Debates about all aspects of free speech and censorship, including the very meaning of those concepts, will no doubt continue. Indeed, especially for all of us who support free speech, however we might understand it, that inevitability is positive, exemplifying free speech in action. These debates will be most fruitful, though, if they are based on sound information about the pertinent facts and issues, including the current tenets of First Amendment law and the actual impacts of free speech and censorship in various contexts, including in various countries and historical periods. Both anecdotal and survey evidence indicates that there is significant hostility toward certain core First Amendment principles, but that this hostility reflects a misunderstanding of those principles. The hostility is actually aimed at a distorted, caricatured version of those principles. Correspondingly, people tend to become more supportive of free speech when they learn what the current speech protective principles actually are and the history that led to them. Let me cite one key example. Critics of free speech regularly lambaste supposed free speech absolutists, including some Supreme Court justices, who purportedly reject any speech restrictions at all and even maintain that speech can do no harm. Yet the reality is that even, indeed especially, the strongest free speech proponents recognize speech's great power, which necessarily can do great harm as well as great good. Correspondingly, even the strongest free speech proponent support limits on the most dangerous speech, speech that directly, imminently causes or threatens certain specific serious harms, such as by intentionally inciting violent conduct that is likely to happen imminently. Moreover, advocates of robust free speech recognize that speech may well contribute to significant harm, even if it doesn't satisfy this so-called emergency standard. But free speech advocates also recognize the dangers of vesting government with increased censorial powers. In fairness, it must likewise be acknowledged that proponents of particular speech restrictions are also too often inaccurately characterized, in their case as censors, without recognizing that they are committed to free speech in general, but reach different conclusions about the comparative harms of permitting and restricting specific speech. Once participants in free speech debates are aware of the actual speech protective and speech restrictive principles that the Supreme Court has enforced and the actual positions that various advocates espouse, the debates can shift from the false binaries of free speech versus censorship to the real issues. Which speech should be restricted and under what circumstances? Knowledge is power. This intentionally short book necessarily is confined to the broad principles and analytical approaches that govern specific controversies, but it does not lay out how judges and other policymakers have enforced these general guidelines in all of the myriad particular situations in which they arise. As the book explains, the resolution of each case is highly fact-specific, turning on all the pertinent facts and circumstances. In many cases, different decision-makers, including various Supreme Court justices, reach different conclusions about how the governing standards apply in the specific context at stake. On the one hand, listeners might well be frustrated by the absence of straightforward, simple answers to particular free speech questions. On the other hand, though, I hope that listeners will consider the more complicated free speech reality empowering. Once you are conversant with the governing general guidelines, you are as well positioned as anyone else to analyze and advocate how those guidelines should apply to any specific factual scenario. Furthermore, once you realize that there is no single, simple, correct resolution of most free speech controversies, you should have the self-confidence to formulate and voice your own views about them. I hope you will exercise your free speech rights to do so. Consistent with the mission of Oxford University Press's What Everyone Needs to Know series, this book seeks to offer, quote, a balanced and authoritative primer, close quote, on free speech. Accordingly, I write this book in my role as a free speech scholar and educator, not as a free speech advocate. Nonetheless, education about free speech tends to promote its protection in two ways. First, evidence shows that the more accurate information people have about free speech principles, history, and impact, the more supportive they are likely to become. Second, knowledge about free speech is a prerequisite for its defense. Freedom of speech is not self-enforcing, and government officials can get away with violating it unless they are held accountable for doing so. For victims of free speech violations to take corrective action, they must, of course, be aware of such violations. In other words, they must know what their rights are. Notwithstanding my belief and hope that listeners will become more supportive of free speech by virtue of knowing more about it, in the true spirit of free speech, I would consider my educational efforts a failure if I did not stimulate critical thinking about all the answers to all the questions in this book. My goal for every listener is the same goal I have set for all my law students. You should be able not only to answer every question, but also to question every answer. While this book addresses what everyone needs to know about free speech, it also presents what everyone wants to know about free speech because it reflects the tens of thousands of questions on point that people have been asking me throughout my adult lifetime. Accordingly, I have written this book in the mode of listening to and dialoguing with interested members of the public, rather than lecturing to, or worse yet, preaching at you. I hope that, at least for most listeners, this book responds to your most pressing questions. So, let the book's questions and answers, and the additional questions and answers I hope they will provoke, begin, but never end. 1. Free Speech Fundamentals. A threshold question. What is this book's overall structure? The book begins with some introductory questions and answers about the importance of free speech, which highlight the universal and timeless support for and opposition to it. Accordingly, the book explains how this fundamental concept transcends the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, indeed how it transcends any law or legal system by encompassing cultural elements as well. That said, the First Amendment constitutes one of the longest-lasting legal sources of free speech protection, which has had an enduring worldwide impact. Both its language and the Supreme Court's many cases interpreting it have influenced the free speech protections and limits that subsequently have been incorporated into the law of many other countries, as well as international and regional human rights treaties. For these reasons, this book focuses on the First Amendment's language and the Supreme Court's precedents enforcing it. First Amendment free expression law is notoriously complicated, consisting of hundreds of Supreme Court decisions spanning more than a century, some of which are in tension, if not squarely inconsistent, with each other. The Supreme Court lays out First Amendment law on a case-by-case basis, and the court can't control what lawsuits are initiated, let alone which lower court rulings will be presented to it for review. Therefore, there are important First Amendment issues that it has not considered or has not reconsidered for a long time, despite significant intervening legal and factual developments. Moreover, the court has declined to address certain issues even when they are presented in cases on its docket. For these reasons, any generalization about the court's rulings is subject to qualifications and exceptions. Given this book's intentionally short length, it highlights the broad patterns and themes in First Amendment law and the underlying rationales they reflect, while omitting the details and caveats that would be included in a legal brief or law review article. Before discussing the major precepts of First Amendment law individually, the book provides a broader overview by answering the following two questions. What are the 5 most important facts that everyone needs to know about freedom of speech? And what are the 12 most important, most challenging arguments against the strong free speech protection in current First Amendment law? And what are the strongest counter-arguments? The answers to the first question preview central aspects of First Amendment law that subsequent answers explore in more detail. The answers to the second question highlight the major themes that have emerged through the Supreme Court's evolving First Amendment case law. These themes broadly unify an enormously variegated body of decisions and undergird the modern court's general trend toward more robust speech protection across many specific free speech law issues, which began to gain momentum in the 1960s. What's the relationship between freedom of speech and the First Amendment? Many people use the terms freedom of speech and First Amendment interchangeably, but these two terms refer to distinct concepts. First Amendment free speech rights constitute a subset of the more wide-ranging concept of freedom of speech to which individuals worldwide long have aspired. The First Amendment provides important protection for, quote, the freedom of speech, close quote, vis-a-vis U.S. officials, but even within the United States, the general concept of speech freedom extends beyond that protection. For example, students and faculty members at most private colleges and universities can expect their academic institutions to protect their basic free speech rights, such as the right to criticize campus policies, but these rights are secured by other sources of law, not the First Amendment, because the First Amendment does not impose obligations on private sector entities. Additionally, the general concept of free speech has been embraced by people all over the world throughout history, wholly apart from any legal protections. Indeed, the U.S. government is premised on the view that free speech, along with other unalienable rights, is a natural human right with which we are endowed by virtue of our humanity, and that the purpose of our laws and government is to secure that pre-existing right. The phrases I have cited are in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. No matter how speech protective our laws might be, freedom of speech still will not be a vital reality unless we reinforce free speech law with a free speech culture in which individuals actually exercise and support free speech. The British writer George Orwell underscored this essential real-world dimension of free speech. Quote, "If large numbers of people believe in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. But if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be prosecuted, even if laws exist to protect them." Close quote. Why does everyone need to know anything about free speech? Why do we need to know anything more than that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech? To know the abstract generalization that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech is no substitute for appreciating the infinite array of specific expression, including some that is deeply important to each listener personally, that depends on the strong speech protective principles now embodied in First Amendment law, but that was subject to punishment and suppression throughout most of American history. Too many of us who have the privilege of living in the contemporary United States and other countries with strong free speech protection take for granted the robust but hard-won freedom of speech for which countless people have struggled and sacrificed throughout history and around the world, even putting their very lives on the line. In the United States, although freedom of speech has been explicitly guaranteed since the First Amendment's ratification in 1791, it wasn't consistently protected until the second half of the 20th century. Before then, the First Amendment was regularly ignored and violated with impunity by government officials ranging from police officers to presidents, who predictably stifled speech with which they disagreed, including speech advocating progressive causes, abolition, women's suffrage, reproductive freedom, labor rights, anti-war movements, socialism, civil rights, and LGBTQ+ rights. Not until 1925 did the Supreme Court recognize that the First Amendment imposes any limits at all on speech violations by state and local officials, which were rampant. And not until 1965 did the Supreme Court first strike down a federal law under the First Amendment, although Congress had a long history of passing such laws dating all the way back to the infamous 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized criticism of government officials, a preeminently important type of speech in our democratic republic. As recently as the 1960s, civil rights demonstrators were regularly punished for their efforts to peacefully protest racial apartheid, which is why Martin Luther King wrote his historic Letter from Birmingham Jail. Far from government protecting Dr. King's free speech rights and those of his allies in the civil rights movement, it punished them for daring to try to exercise these rights. To this day, advocates of human rights and democracy in many other countries continue to face imprisonment or worse for seeking to convey their ideas. They necessarily recognize that freedom of speech is the essential engine for promoting their causes, as well as any other cause. Cherian George, who was born in Singapore and is a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, contrasted this view among Asian human rights activists with the views of their American counterparts after he spent a semester as a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania in 2018. Quote, "In the activist circles that I inhabit in Asia, the left, including feminists and those fighting for minority rights, is solidly aligned with free speech advocates because they know from experience that whenever speech is restricted, they suffer disproportionately. Perhaps the American left feel they can afford to be blasé, even reckless, about free speech, because they know that when they really need it, the First Amendment will be there for them. It's a risk that progressives in most of the rest of the world can't afford to take." Close quote. Why do we all need to know about free speech, regardless of our political beliefs? There are many ongoing threats to free speech, even in the United States, including threats to speech that is consistent with progressive values. For instance, state laws that seek to stifle peaceful protesters or that bar the teaching of certain subjects or perspectives concerning race and gender in K-12 public schools or even in higher educational institutions. Therefore, progressives in the United States, along with the progressives in most of the rest of the world, to whom Professor George referred in the previous quote, also can't afford to risk losing the safety net that First Amendment law has provided for their expression. The same is true for all of us, no matter who we are or what we believe. Given the wonderful diversity of our pluralistic society, no matter what your identities or ideologies might be, some of your views will be seen by some other members of our society as wrong and even evil and dangerous. You will not be able to depend on majority support for all of your ideas at any particular level of government. Maybe your ideas on a particular issue might be popular in your local community, but they might well be unpopular in a larger community, or vice versa. For example, the favored policy views of progressive college students might be popular in their campus community, but deeply unpopular even in the city where the campus is located, let alone at the state or national level. In some contexts, concerning some cherished views that we seek to express, all of us will inevitably depend on the First Amendment's shield against the tyranny of the majority. It is often quipped that most people support freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. The clear lesson of free speech law and the history that gave rise to it is that there can be no freedom of speech for me unless there is also freedom of speech for thee. Will knowing about free speech have any positive, tangible impacts on your life? Knowledge about general free speech principles is essential for understanding and participating in the many current debates about particular free speech issues. More generally, knowledge about your own free speech rights should encourage you to vigorously exercise those rights in order to gain all the benefits that free speech promises, ranging from your own self-expression of who you are and what you feel, to conveying your ideas about political issues so that you can affect how those issues are resolved. Knowledge is power, and even people who are disempowered in other ways, for instance, not enjoying the right to vote, have been able to express themselves and also to successfully influence issues of concern to them because they were aware of their free speech rights. Many students who are too young to vote have prevailed in lawsuits against school officials who sought to prevent the students from engaging in certain kinds of expression because the students were aware of their rights and accordingly sought legal assistance from supportive lawyers or organizations. One recent illustration is the Supreme Court's 2021 decision protecting the free speech rights of high school student Brandy Levy. The court held that Brandy's school had violated those rights when it disciplined her for Snapchat messages she had posted to her friends on her cell phone, expressing her anger toward certain school officials for actions that she considered unfair. In one fell swoop, she was able to enjoy the diverse benefits of multiple types of expression. The self-expression of blowing off steam through her strongly worded messages, including
Sample complete. Ready to continue?